Welcome to episode 29 of the Rescued by Dragons podcast, Tales of the Brunch Club, a fantasy fiction podcast inspired by a weekly homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign. My name is Brian Messmer, and I invite you to picture yourself in a cozy, torchlit tavern, ale in hand, gathered around a table with other listeners, waiting to hear the next chapter in the Tales of the Brunch Club. But first, a quick recap. In episode 28, the Brunch Club gave Solania papers that proved Lady Tyrol was the assassin Varjo, just as Ahura Mazda claimed. She told them she had a job for them that would help them gain favor with the Council of Five, but would reveal the job the next day. Finally able to leave Lady Tyrol's villa, they found their coachman passed out drunk in the carriage. Salis eagerly volunteered to drive, but lost control of the horses and damaged some property on the way back to the inn. They were fined heavily for the damage, but avoided a night in jail. Solania visited Vorjon in the bathroom, revealing it was her that sent him the secret note. She told him that they should meet her representative at the ruins of the Temple of the Raven Queen in Elnor at midnight, and that they would be granted a special license to use divine magic during their errand. The group visited Captain Grath, who decided to take the afternoon off and spend it with Alora, while the rest of the party went back to the inn to rest before the night ahead. And now, episode 29, Corridors of Death. Vorjon slept for a while. He woke up early in the evening when he heard footsteps walking past his room and a door opened down the hall. He assumed it was Alora returning from her afternoon in the Port District. He was happy for her that she was able to spend some time with Captain Grath. In their line of work, one should take advantage of happy moments whenever they can. A clock tower in the distance told them there were still a few hours before they needed to leave for the Temple of the Raven Queen. He laid his armor and shield neatly on the floor, and sat quietly on his bed, and began methodically inspecting each joint and seam of his armor, repairing it where he could, then polishing it to gleaming perfection. He did the same with his shield, popping out the more flexible dents and reinforcing the straps where they were frayed. The last item that needed his attention was Eclipse. The two-headed flail had no visible damage, not even a nick or a scratch, which he found remarkable. "I must be on the right path to have Bahamut bless me with such a weapon," the paladin thought to himself. He painstakingly cleaned dried blood from the crevices of the etched sun and moon orbs that topped the flail. Eclipse shone brightly after it too was lovingly polished. The paladin began putting on his armor when the 11 chimes of the clock tower told him it was time to get ready. "Vorjon, are you ready yet?" Drusilla said in a typically annoyed tone as she banged on his door. She opened it to find the Dragonborn on one knee, head down, moving his mouth as if he was speaking, but no sounds came out. "Oh, sorry," Drusilla said when she realized he was praying again, as was his ritual every evening. "Not to worry," Vorjon said, standing up and smiling at her. "I was just finishing. Are the others ready?" he asked. "Yes, they're waiting for us," the cleric said. When she turned around to walk out the door, Vorjon noticed the long cloak of pristine white fur that hung from her shoulders down to the back of her knees. "Are you wearing the Winterwolf cloak?" Vorjon asked appreciatively. It's beautiful." "Yeah, Alora picked them up on her way back from Grath's," she told him. "I'm still waiting for the right pair of boots to go with it, though." A playful smile flitted across her features as she teased the paladin. Vorjon couldn't help but grin at the old joke as they joined the others. The Brunch Club found themselves walking briskly and running late. They thought they had given themselves plenty of time to meet Solania's representative at the ruined Temple of the Raven Queen, but were told that no carriage service wanted to pick them up. "Nice going, Salis," Diesa grumbled as they walked quickly through the streets of Elnor. Even though it was winter, they were already sweating under the thick fur of their new cloaks. "Hey, I didn't hear any of you guys offer to drive," Salis said, "and it was going really well until it suddenly wasn't." Even though they were in a hurry, they couldn't keep themselves from slowing down when they approached the remains of the old temple district. The finely hewn stone and well-crafted facades of the mage-controlled portion of the city gave way to piles of rubble and crumbling shells of once great cathedrals. Broken steeples that at one time stood high in the air now lay crumbling in piles of their own shattered stone. Not even the dead were spared the indignity of neglect. The graveyards were full of broken markers and buried under the collapsed walls of the churches that once stood by their side. They were relieved to see a lone figure seated on a large granite block just before Elnor's clock struck midnight. When they got close, they could see a raven carved in bas relief in the figure's seat. It was upside down as if it had fallen out of the sky. "Are you waiting for us?" Drusilla asked. The woman said nothing and looked at each of them. She was dressed in a black cloak with the hood pulled up. She pulled the hood down to reveal her face. She had chestnut hair, matching eyes, and the facial features of a half-elf. "Come, the sooner you get started, the better." She immediately turned towards the crumbling temple behind her. She led them past some piles of rubble to a set of wooden doors set into the ground. A heavy timber beam lay across it. The beam was nested in L-shaped brackets, keeping the door from opening from the inside. Borjan took a step forward to remove the beam. Before he could touch it, though, the half-elf waved her hand. The beam moved on its own. It rose up just enough to glide out of the brackets and onto the ground without making a noise. The representative waved her hand again, and the doors opened quietly. They could see the doors were solid oak and very thick. The underside of the door was covered in carved runic symbols. The open doors revealed a staircase which led down to a large antechamber. Old carvings were crumbling along the columns. They looked to be flocks of birds flying towards the sky, but many of them had cracked, faded, or fallen. "Follow me," the half-elf said. When they gathered in the room, she told them their mission. A few weeks ago, an undead corpse was found wandering in the Granite District. It was quickly dealt with and traced back to here. A few more appeared, and then more, and more. We sealed them in, but the council wants to know what's causing it. Your job is to search the tombs and find out what's raising them, destroy it if you can, and kill as many undead along the way as possible. "Solania said Drusilla and I would be allowed to use our divine magic. Is that true?" Borjan asked. The representative nodded and handed him and Drusilla each a small rolled parchment. "Keep these on you while you're in Elnor. They grant you permission to use your holy powers while on council business," she told them. She then quietly added, "May the gods be with you," as she turned from them and ascended the stairs. They watched the doors close above them and heard the heavy timber settle into place. How do we get out?" Alora wondered as they stood in the darkness. 3 floating orbs conjured by Drusilla guided them down a long flight of stairs that was interrupted by a landing every 10 feet or so. The landings led to no rooms or hallways, just more stairs downward. The 5th landing finally ended in a 20-foot hallway which had an open doorway into a room at the end. Borjan whispered for them to stop when they had all reached the bottom of the stairs. He concentrated on his surroundings and opened his mind. His heightened awareness of the fiendish and undead forces told him what lay in the room ahead. 7 undead and 2 ghouls, he whispered. "Don't let the ghouls claw or bite you," Drusilla warned. "We should lure them out," said Alora, removing her phoenix arrow from her quiver. "Wait," Borjan said, then turned to Diesa. "Hold out your axe, please," he told her. Diesa held her battle axe in front of Borjan. He removed a small glass vial, wrapped up in a rag. He emptied the vial, pouring a clear, viscous liquid on both sides of each blade. He rubbed the oil in with the rag. "Holy oil. It hurts undead," he explained. Drusilla sent one of her dancing lights through the door, bobbed it up and down, and slowly drew it back to her. "It's like fishing for corpses," said Salas. "Kill the ghouls first if you can," said Borjan. "How will we know which one's a ghoul and not just a zombie?" Diesa asked gruffly. Just then, a rotting humanoid stumbled out of the chamber into the hall. It swatted at the orb of light with long claws, like a corpse's overgrown fingernails. A tongue with chunks of it missing lolled from its slack jaw, unnaturally long and swaying with its movements. The ghoul paused and turned its attention to the group as its stench wafted around it. "Oh, I see," said Diesa, gripping her battle axe tighter, willing the stench out of her nostrils. The whole party could already feel their stomachs churning. "Ignis," Alora said, commanding the tip of her arrow to burst into flame. The arrow sailed down the hallway and set the ghoul's tattered clothing on fire on its way through the creature's cold, dead heart. Salas finished it off with 3 magic missiles to the chest. "Conserve your magic missiles, Salas. We don't know how many of these we'll have to face tonight, or what kind of creature is making them," Borjan said. Yeah, Dragon Breath, don't worry about me," Salas laughed as she set another undead aflame with a firebolt. Drusilla called forth a sacred flame to engulf another undead that shambled through the doorway. As more creatures entered the hallway, they were met with fire and arrows. When the second ghoul fell, Borjan approached the doorway. He stayed along the hallway wall, giving plenty of room for arrows to zip by. He engaged the last of the undead, crushing its rotting skull easily under the weight of Eclipse. Alora retrieved a couple of her arrows, and Diesa began inspecting the pockets of the moldering, tattered clothing. "What are you doing?" Drusilla asked with disgust in her voice. "Looking for loot, duh. What else would I be doing?" Diesa said as she moved from corpse to corpse. "What kind of loot do you expect to find on corpses from a tomb?" asked Vorjon. "I mean, it's not like they're going to be using their loot in the tomb either," Salas chimed in. But Diesa found no loot. Vorjon led the way into the next room. It was empty. It appeared to be a repository of cremated ashes as urns set in recesses lined the walls. On the opposite wall was the only other door. It led into another hallway which again seemed to open into a room 20 feet long. Vorjon reached out with his divine sense once again. 7 more undead and another ghoul, he told them. "See if you can lure them all out," Salas said. Vorjon walked halfway down the hall and stopped. He said a prayer as he raised a clips. It glowed brightly and filled the hall with bright divine light. The light drew 2 of the undead into the hallway. Vorjon struck the first down with a clips. Alora and Drusilla killed the second with a couple phoenix arrow shots and a sacred flame. 4 more undead and the ghoul entered the hallway. "Step aside, Vorjon!" Salas shouted as she extended her hands. Vorjon backed up against the wall as a bolt of lightning crackled past him. It struck the ghoul and passed through him to the next 4 undead. The undead dropped to the ground. Their smoking corpses sparked with residual electricity. The ghoul moved forward towards Vorjon, but was struck down from behind by Diesa's battle axe. It collapsed into a pile of motionless, decaying flesh. "Oh, this holy oil works nice," Diesa enthused as she turned to face another undead emerging from the doorway. The remaining undead were cut down quickly. Diesa once again searched their pockets in vain, and the Brunch Club moved forward into the next room. The next hallway ended another long staircase downwards. They descended the steps, which turned into another long hallway that snaked around a corner about 60 feet away. Salas summoned Pip and asked him to scout around the corner. The surly owl begrudgingly obeyed and flew down the hall. When he returned, he told them the hallway around the corner was wider and also about 60 feet long. It ended at a wall with a small doorway in the center that led into a large room. The room contained more undead corpses, animated skeletons, and some angry-looking spirits. "Does he know how many?" Vorjon asked after Salas relayed Pip's information. "The room was full of zombies and ghosts. I wasn't sticking around to do a head count, you shiny asshole," answered Pip, though only Salas could hear him. He said he didn't want to risk it." Drusilla kept 2 of her dancing lights behind them, using only one to guide them down the hallway so the light would be less noticeable around the corner. When they reached the end of the hall, they decided to creep forward in the blackness, leading Vorjon along with them as he was the only member of the group without dark vision. When they got within 30 feet of the door, they stopped to make a plan. "I can set a trap in front of the door," Diesa offered. "There's enough room on either side of the door for Vorjon and I to ambush whoever comes out," Drusilla said. "You guys are fucking loud. Let me set the trap first," said Diesa as she moved quietly down the hallway. The party members with dark vision could see only her silhouette as she crouched down, removed some items from her bag, and prepared a trap. "Ready," Diesa said when she returned to the group. "Don't fuck it up," she added to Vorjon and Drusilla as they began moving into position as quietly as their armor would allow. Fortunately, these undead were not the most observant creatures, and the paladin and cleric were able to take their positions on either side of the doorway. "We need to draw them out," Alora said. Salas took a torch from her pack and lit it. "Wow, it's so dark and lonely down here," she exclaimed loudly. "It's really scary for a little gnome like me, all alone, helpless, tasty." 2 of the undead corpses shuffled out of the doorway. A skeleton followed, quickly catching up to them. They passed through the door, never noticing Vorjon and Drusilla on either side of it. When they reached the site of Diesa's trap, the first 2 undead stepped on the ball bearings spread out along the floor and fell into seated positions. The skeleton tried to go around but slipped in the oil the rogue had also poured on the floor. "Now!" Diesa shouted. Alora ignited her phoenix arrow and shot it to the oil-soaked floor. The floor burst into flames and quickly engulfed the 3 undead creatures. They wailed as they desperately tried to stand and run, but could not stop themselves from repeatedly falling down into the ball bearings and burning oil. Vorjon said a prayer, and Eclipse glowed with divine light. Drusilla said a prayer of her own. A spectral raven appeared at her side. As soon as another skeleton stepped through the door, the cleric's raven attacked it. Vorjon whispered a quick prayer and hit the undead fiend from the other side. The decaying ribs cracked under the paladin's blow, and the explosive energy of his divine smite felled the skeleton on impact. The next zombie to come through the door tripped and fell over the scattered bones, making an easy target for Drusilla and Vorjan. The growing pile of bodies made it difficult for the uncoordinated undead to get into the hallway quickly. This made it easy for the party to pick them off one by one. The battle seemed to be drawing to a close when 3 ghostly figures streamed through the door. They floated quickly around the pile of corpses and bones. Diesa shot one with her shortbow, but the arrow appeared to slip through it without doing noticeable damage. "You need to use magic against them," Vorjan shouted down the hallway to his companions. One of the spirits heard the shout and turned to attack him. Fortunately, Eclipse was a magical weapon, and the damage it inflicted caused the ghost to scream in agony. Diesa slung her bow over her shoulder and withdrew her axe. She charged the second ghost form and swung at it. The spectral skin hissed from the holy oil on her blade as she cut into it. Alora ignited her phoenix arrow and let it fly at the other spectre that was charging them. The phoenix arrow once again sailed through it, but the magical flame left a scorched hole all the way through the ghostly body. Drusilla's sacred flame finished it off. Vorjan cut down his spectre with a second blow from Eclipse, while Salus used a barrage of magic missiles to finish off the one Diesa had wounded. "Did you really need to waste a powerful spell on the last ghost?" Vorjan said to the sorceress, passive-aggressively reminding her that they should conserve their spell energy. "Nope, I did not," said Salus, "but it felt great." Diesa retrieved her arrows and inspected the moldy clothing for valuables. Once again, there was nothing. "Does anyone need to rest?" Drusilla asked. "Diesa's holy oil only lasts an hour. We should press on," said Vorjan. The rest of the party agreed, and they stepped forward into what they hoped was an empty room. Our tale will continue next week in episode 30. Episode 29 was written by Dominic White and myself, Brian Messmer. The story is based upon my own homebrew Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Valuable contributions to the story were added by the role-playing of Bethany Powers, who plays Diesa, J.P. Black, who plays Drusilla, Liz Richard, who plays Alora, Anna Flemke, who plays Salus, and Dominic White, who plays Vorjan. Ambience and effects used with permission by Michael Gelfi. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help us out by sharing it with your friends. We'd really appreciate it. More information about Rescued by Dragons and ways to support the podcast can be found at rescuedbydragons.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Rescued by Dragons, on Twitter at Rescued Dragons, and on YouTube under Rescued by Dragons. Thank you for listening, and please join us next week to find out, along with the rest of us, what happens next. Outro music.